What happens when one of America's most respected public figures comes face to face with late-night television's most unpredictable host, and a seemingly innocent interview question ignites a firestorm that nobody saw coming? Tonight, we're diving deep into the explosive confrontation that left audiences stunned, cameras rolling, and an entire studio holding its breath as two powerhouse personalities clashed in ways that would make headlines for weeks to come. This is the untold story of how a routine promotional appearance turned into television's most unforgettable meltdown, where diplomatic composure met comedic chaos, and neither side was willing to back down. Before we get started, make sure to hit that subscribe button and drop a comment below, telling us what you think really went down that night, because trust me, you're going to have opinions about this one. The stage was set like any other Tuesday evening at the El Capitan Entertainment Center in Hollywood. Jimmy Kimmel Live was preparing for what should have been a straightforward interview segment, the kind of polished promotional conversation that had become standard fare for the show's roster of high-profile guests. The production team had spent weeks coordinating the appearance, working through multiple layers of scheduling and security protocols that come with hosting someone of Michelle Obama's stature. Everything appeared perfectly orchestrated, from the carefully arranged lighting that would complement the guest's complexion to the strategically placed audience members who had been briefed on appropriate response cues. Michelle Obama arrived that evening carrying herself with the same grace and poise that had defined her 8 years in the White House. Dressed in an elegant navy blazer that struck the perfect balance between professional authority and television-friendly approachability, she embodied the kind of refined confidence that had made her one of the most admired figures in American public life. Her team of handlers moved with practiced efficiency, checking last-minute details and ensuring that every aspect of the appearance would reinforce the carefully cultivated image that had become synonymous with her brand of aspirational leadership. As the commercial break drew to a close, both host and guest took their positions under the bright studio lights. The audience, primed and energetic, offered the kind of warm reception that had become customary for Michelle Obama's television appearances. Kimmel's opening was delivered with his characteristic blend of self-deprecating humor and genuine admiration. "Well, we have an absolutely incredible guest tonight," Kimmel began, his voice carrying the practiced enthusiasm that had served him well throughout his career. "Someone who needs no introduction, but I'm going to give her one anyway because that's literally my job. Please welcome the former First Lady of the United States, best-selling author, and someone who could probably run this country better than most people currently trying to, Michelle Obama." The applause was thunderous as Michelle Obama made her entrance, waving graciously to the crowd before settling into the guest chair with the kind of effortless elegance that had made her a global icon. Her smile was warm and genuine as she acknowledged the audience's enthusiasm. "Thank you so much for having me, Jimmy," she said, her voice carrying that familiar blend of warmth and authority that had captivated audiences for over a decade. "Though I have to say, that introduction might have been a little too generous." "Oh, please," Kimmel replied with a grin. "If anything, I undersold it. I mean, let's be honest, you've written books that have topped bestseller lists, you've championed causes that have actually changed lives, and you managed to raise 2 incredible daughters while living in a fishbowl. Meanwhile, my biggest accomplishment this week was remembering to wear matching socks." The audience laughed, and Michelle Obama's response was equally warm. "Well, matching socks is actually a pretty big deal. You'd be surprised how many world leaders I've met who couldn't manage that basic task." The first several minutes continued in this comfortable rhythm, with questions about her latest book project met with thoughtful, articulate responses that showcased both her intelligence and her ability to connect with audiences across demographic lines. She spoke passionately about the importance of education and the ongoing work of her foundation. "You know, one of the things I've learned is that young people today are facing challenges that we couldn't have imagined even 10 years ago," she explained, her hands moving expressively as she spoke. The pressure from social media, the uncertainty about the future, the feeling that the systems that are supposed to support them are failing. But what gives me hope is their resilience, their creativity, their absolute refusal to accept that things have to stay the way they are. That's beautifully put, Kimmel responded, leaning forward in his chair. And speaking of not accepting the way things are, I have to ask about something that's been on a lot of people's minds lately. There was a subtle shift in his tone, barely, perceptible but enough to make Michelle Obama's media-trained instincts kick in. Her posture remained relaxed, but her eyes sharpened slightly as she prepared for whatever was coming next. You've been very vocal about the importance of civic engagement, about encouraging people to vote and participate in democracy, Kimmel continued. But I'm curious about your thoughts on something more specific. There's been a lot of discussion lately about whether the Democratic Party has lost touch with working-class voters, particularly in communities that used to be reliable strongholds. Some people are saying that the party has become too focused on coastal elites and has forgotten about the people who actually build and maintain this country. What's your take on that? The question hung in the air for a moment, and perceptive. Viewers might have noticed the slightest tightening around Michelle Obama's eyes. It was a loaded question, one that seemed to challenge not just party strategy, but the very foundation of the political coalition she had spent years helping to build and maintain. "Well, Jimmy," she began, her voice maintaining its characteristic warmth, but with a new edge of precision. "I think that's a pretty simplistic way to frame a very complex issue. The idea that there's some kind of divide between coastal elites and working-class Americans assumes that those are mutually exclusive categories, which they're not. I've met plenty of working-class people in California and New York, and plenty of wealthy people in Ohio and Michigan." "Sure, but you know what I mean," Kimmel pressed, and there was something in his tone that suggested he was deliberately pushing beyond the boundaries of typical late-night television discourse. "The numbers don't lie. The party lost ground in areas where it used to dominate, places where people feel like their concerns aren't being heard anymore. Don't you think there's some validity to the criticism that the party has become disconnected from its roots?" Michelle Obama's response revealed the first real sign that the diplomatic veneer was beginning to show strain. Her smile remained in place, but it had taken on a quality that anyone familiar with high-stakes political communication would recognize as a warning sign. "I think what's really disconnected," she said, her words chosen with surgical precision, "is the assumption that working-class Americans are somehow unable to care about multiple issues at the same time. The idea that you can't be concerned about both economic opportunity and social justice, that you can't want both good-paying jobs and equal rights for all Americans. That kind of thinking is exactly what keeps us divided when we should be working together." The studio audience, initially unaware that they were witnessing the beginning of something unprecedented, began to sense the shift in energy. The easy laughter that had punctuated the first half of the interview gave way to a more attentive silence, the kind of focused attention that emerges when people realize they might be watching something significant unfold in real time. Kimmel, either oblivious to or deliberately ignoring the warning signs in his guest's demeanor, decided to push even further into dangerous territory. His next question would prove to be the match that lit the fuse on what was about to become television's most explosive interview meltdown. "But Michelle, come on," he said, his voice taking on a tone that suggested he was about to cross a line that most hosts would never dare approach. "Let's talk about what really happened. I mean, we all watched the same election results. We all saw how certain communities that had been loyal to the Democratic Party for decades suddenly switched sides. Don't you think there's something to be said for the argument that maybe, just maybe, the party started caring more about pronouns than paychecks?" The words hung in the studio air like a toxic cloud. The audience, which had been murmuring quietly during the previous exchange, fell into complete silence. Even the production crew seemed to freeze, sensing that something unprecedented was about to unfold before their cameras. Michelle Obama's transformation was immediate and visible. The diplomatic smile that had been her trademark for over a decade vanished entirely, replaced by an expression of barely controlled fury that few people had ever seen from someone who had spent years mastering the art of political composure under the most intense scrutiny imaginable. "Excuse me?" she said, her voice dropping to a level that somehow managed to be both quiet and thunderous at the same time. "Did you just suggest that caring about basic human dignity and respect for all Americans is somehow incompatible with economic policy? Did you just reduce the fundamental rights of American citizens to a talking point about pronouns?" Kimmel, perhaps realizing that he had ventured into territory that was far more dangerous than he had anticipated, attempted to backtrack with a nervous laugh. "I'm not saying that. I'm just asking whether you think the messaging might have gotten a little, out of balance." "Out of balance?" Michelle Obama's voice was now carrying an edge that could have cut glass. "Jimmy, let me tell you what's out of balance. What's out of balance is a television host sitting here suggesting that fighting for the rights of transgender Americans, or any marginalized community, is somehow a political miscalculation, rather than a moral imperative. What's out of balance is the idea that we have to choose between economic justice and social justice when they're the same fight." The studio had become so quiet that the hum of the cameras was audible. Kimmel, clearly struggling to regain control of an interview that had spiraled far beyond anything he had experienced in his career, made another attempt at damage control. "Look, I think maybe we're getting a little too deep into the weeds here," he said, his voice betraying the nervousness that was beginning to overtake his usual confident demeanor. "I was just trying to have a conversation about political strategy, not about anyone's fundamental rights." "No, Jimmy," Michelle Obama interrupted, her voice now carrying the full weight of her accumulated years of experience dealing with political attacks and media manipulation. "You don't get to do that. You don't get to ask loaded questions designed to get a reaction and then pretend you were just making casual conversation when someone calls you out on it. You knew exactly what you were doing when you framed that question the way you did." The former First Lady leaned forward in her chair, her posture now radiating the kind of controlled intensity that had made her such a formidable advocate during her years in public service. "Let me be absolutely clear about something, because I think you and your audience need to understand this. The Democratic Party didn't lose elections because we cared too much about human rights. We lost elections because people were fed a steady diet of misinformation designed to make them think that caring about other people's dignity somehow threatened their own economic security." Kimmel, visibly uncomfortable but apparently unable to resist continuing down the path he had started, made what would prove to be a fatal error in judgment. "But don't you think that maybe, just maybe, the party could have done a better job of explaining how those issues connect to kitchen table concerns? I mean, when people are worried about paying their mortgage and they're hearing about debates over bathroom policies, it's not unreasonable for them to wonder whether their priorities are being heard." Moy. The explosion that followed was unlike anything that had ever been captured on live television. Michelle Obama's composure, which had been hanging by an increasingly thin thread, finally snapped completely. "Bathroom policies?" she said, her voice now carrying a tone of incredulous rage. "Jimmy, you just referred to the basic human dignity of transgender Americans as bathroom policies. Do you understand what you just did? You just reduced the lived experiences, the safety, the fundamental humanity of an entire group of Americans to a policy debate about bathrooms." Adi. She stood up from her chair, a movement that sent a visible shockwave through the studio audience and production crew. "You know what? I'm done. I'm absolutely done with this conversation, and I'm done with the kind of thinking that treats human rights as political chess pieces." Shy. Kimmel, clearly panicking as he watched his interview disintegrate in real time, made one last desperate attempt to salvage the situation. "Michelle, please, I think there's been a misunderstanding here. I'm not trying to diminish anyone's humanity, I'm just trying to understand the political dynamics of what happened." "No, Jimmy," she replied, her voice now carrying the kind of moral authority that had made her one of the most respected voices in American public life. "There's been no misunderstanding. You knew exactly what you were doing, and so did I. The only question now is whether you're going to own up to it or continue to hide behind this pretense of journalistic curiosity." The camera captured every moment of the confrontation, from the shocked faces in the studio audience to the visible panic in Kimmel's eyes as he realized that his attempt at provocative television had backfired spectacularly. What had started as a routine promotional interview had transformed into a moment of raw, unfiltered confrontation that would define both of their careers in ways neither had anticipated. The studio had become a pressure cooker of tension, with every person present acutely aware that they were witnessing something that would be replayed and analyzed for years to come. Michelle Obama remained standing, her presence commanding the entire space as she prepared to deliver what would become one of the most memorable moments in late-night television history. "You want to talk about political dynamics, Jimmy?" she said, her voice now carrying the full weight of her years of experience navigating the most challenging political environments in the world. "Let me give you some real political dynamics. The reason we keep losing ground isn't because we care too much about human rights. It's because people like you keep framing basic human decency as some kind of luxury that we can't afford when times get tough." Kimmel, sweat now visible on his forehead under the studio lights, made one final attempt to regain control of the situation. "Michelle, I really think you're mischaracterizing what I was trying to say here. I have tremendous respect for you and for all the communities we've been discussing. I was simply trying to explore the political challenges that the party has faced." "No, you weren't," she shot back immediately, her words cutting through his attempt at deflection like a blade. "You were doing exactly what too many people in media do. You were treating the fundamental rights of American citizens as talking points for your entertainment. You were suggesting that standing up for transgender Americans, for immigrant families, for voting rights, for reproductive freedom, somehow makes us out of touch with real Americans. As if those people fighting for their basic dignity aren't real Americans themselves." The former First Lady's voice rose as she continued, passion and righteous anger combining into something that was both beautiful and terrifying to witness. "Do you know what out of touch looks like, Jimmy? Out of touch is sitting in a comfortable studio chair and suggesting that we should throw vulnerable communities under the bus for political convenience. Out of touch is treating human rights like they're some kind of special interest, instead of the foundation of what this country is supposed to represent." The camera operators, trained to capture every moment of live television drama, found themselves struggling to keep up with the intensity of what was unfolding. The audience sat in stunned silence, many of them recording with their phones despite the show's policy against such behavior, instinctively understanding that they were witnessing a moment that would define the cultural conversation for months to come. Kimmel, his usual confidence completely shattered, made what would prove to be his most significant mistake of the entire encounter. "Look, I understand you're passionate about these issues, but don't you think you're being a little unfair here? I mean, we're supposed to be able to have these conversations without people getting so emotional about it." The word emotional landed like a bomb in the already explosive atmosphere. Michelle Obama's expression shifted from anger to something approaching incredulous fury, the kind of reaction that emerges when someone crosses a line that should never have been approached in the first place. "Emotional," she repeated, her voice now carrying a dangerous quiet that was somehow more intimidating than her previous outbursts. "Jimmy, you just spent the last 10 minutes questioning the fundamental worth and dignity of American citizens, and when I respond with the appropriate level of outrage, you want to dismiss me as being too emotional? Do you understand the history of that word when it's used to dismiss women, particularly women of color, who dare to speak truth to power?" She took a step closer to his desk, her presence now completely dominating the studio space. "Let me tell you what emotional looks like. Emotional is a mother watching her transgender child face discrimination and violence because people like you treat their existence as a political debate. Emotional is a family torn apart by immigration policies designed to be cruel rather than effective. Emotional is watching voting rights stripped away while people talk about both sides and political strategy. The studio lights seemed to flicker under the intensity of the moment as Michelle Obama delivered what would become the most quoted portion of the entire confrontation. You want to know what's really emotional, Jimmy? What's emotional is having to sit here and explain to a grown man why treating people with basic human dignity isn't a political calculation, it's a moral requirement. What's emotional is realizing that we've reached a point where standing up for vulnerable Americans is somehow considered divisive rather than essential. Kimmel, clearly overwhelmed and out of his depth, made one last desperate attempt to end the interview on some kind of conciliatory note. Michelle, I really appreciate you coming on the show tonight, and I hope we can continue this conversation in the future. Her response was swift and final. No, Jimmy, we won't be continuing this conversation. Not tonight, not in the future, not ever. Because what happened here tonight wasn't a conversation. It was you using your platform to perpetuate exactly the kind of thinking that makes it harder for vulnerable Americans to live with dignity and safety. She gathered herself with the grace that had defined her public persona for over a decade. But her words carried an edge that made it clear this was not a typical end to a television appearance. I came here tonight to talk about my work, about the young people I'm trying to serve, about the future I believe we can build together. Instead, I got to spend my time explaining why other human beings deserve to be treated as human beings. That says everything anyone needs to know about where we are as a society. With that, Michelle Obama turned and walked toward the edge of the stage, her departure as commanding as her presence had been throughout the confrontation. The studio audience remained frozen in their seats, unsure whether to applaud, boo, or simply sit in stunned silence as they processed what they had just witnessed. Kimmel, left alone at his desk with cameras still rolling and a studio full of people staring at him in disbelief, struggled to find words that could somehow address what had just transpired. His usual comedic timing had completely abandoned him, leaving him looking like exactly what he was in that moment. A man who had vastly overestimated his ability to handle a conversation he never should have started. The confrontation that had begun as a seemingly routine promotional interview had evolved into something far more significant. A raw, unfiltered moment of truth that revealed the deep divides and fundamental disagreements that continue to shape American political and cultural discourse. It was television at its most powerful and uncomfortable, the kind of unscripted reality that reminds viewers why live broadcasting can be both exhilarating and terrifying for everyone involved. What did you think of this explosive confrontation? Was Michelle Obama justified in her reaction, or did Jimmy Kimmel have valid points about political strategy? Drop your thoughts in the comments below, and make sure to subscribe for more deep dives into the moments that define our cultural conversation. The real question is, when public figures clash this dramatically on live television, who really wins and who really loses?